Some people believe they can measure someone's worth by the price of their clothes, the model of their car, or their address. Andre was one of those people. He thought wealth was synonymous with superiority, and that those who lacked shine on the outside had nothing on the inside. Until the day he laughed at a simple woman, and began, unknowingly, to create his own downfall. Because there's something dangerous about arrogance. It makes us mistake silence for weakness and humility for defeat. Andre believed that the woman with her hurried steps and worn clothes was nothing more than an irrelevant detail in the world of winners. But what he didn't know, and the world loves to point out, is that true. Giants are often born invisible, until they grow up enough to become impossible to ignore, and that's exactly what happened. The woman he mocked on the sidewalk would return years later, not as a supporting character, but as the protagonist of a turn of events so improbable, so brutal and so inspiring that it would shatter all of Andre's certainties, and perhaps his own as well. The initial mockery. From the first moment he saw her, he wrinkled his nose with an almost automatic disdain. It was as if his mind had been trained to react this way to any hint of simplicity. The woman walked along the sidewalk with hurried steps, balancing a cloth bag that seemed too heavy for her thin arms. She wore a worn coat, her hair tied up haphazardly, and a firm but tired look in her eyes. He, on the other hand, was leaning back in the leather armchair of an upscale cafe, surrounded by marble columns and the aroma of freshly ground coffee. As she passed the window, he raised an eyebrow, then let out a muffled chuckle, as if her simple figure were a flaw in the luxurious setting he believed to be the center of the world. There was a quiet arrogance in the way he observed people. His name was Andre, and he wore the smile of those who believe the world owes them reverence. There wasn't a single stain on his dark suit, and even the shine on his shoes seemed rehearsed. Andre used to say he could read a person's worth just by the way they dressed or walked. It was as if he had an invisible radar to detect winners and failures, and in his eyes this woman clearly belonged to the latter group. So when she dropped one of the tomatoes she was carrying and bent down to pick it up, he laughed, a quick, restrained but venomous laugh, like the click of a tongue judging without knowing. The curious thing is that those around him noticed. The cafe waitress looked away, embarrassed for him. A gray-bearded man sitting at the next table sighed heavily and returned to his newspaper. But Andre didn't notice the other's discomfort. He was too busy with his own sense of superiority. He believed that laughing at someone was a sign of wit, when in fact it only revealed a deep insecurity. It's always like that with arrogant people. The higher they try to appear, the more fragile the foundation on which their ego rests. Andre didn't know this. Or maybe he did and just pretended not to. As the woman walked away, he made a loud comment to his friend Claudio, who was distractedly fiddling with his cell phone. "You must have forgotten there's a mirror," Andre said, laughing. Claudio looked up and forced a smile awkwardly. It was common to hear such phrases coming from Andre's mouth as he turned judging others into a pastime. Deep down, Claudio had grown accustomed to laughing out of politeness, though he felt less and less inclined to do so. He knew that laughter wasn't just about clothes or appearance. It was about the sick pleasure of diminishing others to make himself feel bigger. And somehow, he knew that this kind of pleasure always exacts a heavy price in the end. Andre, however, saw nothing wrong with it. On the contrary, he considered it a natural reflection of the real world. He used to say that life is a battlefield, and the weak become the rug of the strong. This phrase was even printed on a board in his office, just above his mahogany desk. It was his mantra. He firmly believed that empathy was a luxury for those who had already conquered. And if someone was fighting for survival, as this woman seemed to be, then it was because they didn't try hard enough. He spoke this with the same conviction others speak of the sunrise, as if it were a law of nature. But what he didn't realize, and what life was about to teach him in a painful way, is that the world is rarely as simple as it seems from a penthouse overlooking the sea. Andre didn't know that behind every tired face lies a story he didn't know, battles he never fought, tears he never wiped away. And that's precisely where judgment becomes dangerous, when we believe we know someone only by what our eyes can see. It's like judging a book by its cover, unaware that its pages hold a life-changing story. In the following days, he began to notice that woman more frequently, and each appearance seemed to become a new source of ridicule. It was as if she existed solely to confirm his theories about failure. If he saw her taking the bus, he would comment on those who lacked ambition. If he saw her leaving a neighborhood grocery store, he would joke about people who will never grow up. The ironic thing is that Andre didn't realize that, by trying to prove his worth by putting others down, he was only revealing his own insecurity. Truly confident people don't need to put anyone else down to shine. They shine on their own. During one of these meetings, his wife stopped to tie her shoelace right in front of the cafe where he usually spent his afternoons. Her forehead was sweaty, and her hair was tied back in a makeshift bun. Andre lifted his coffee cup, lifted his chin, and murmured, like someone delivering a judge's final verdict, "A whole life and not a bit of class." Claudio, once again, fell silent. But this time, his eyes lingered on the woman for a few seconds longer than usual. There was something about her that didn't match the portrait Andre painted. A firmness in her gaze, a resilient demeanor of someone unfazed by the world's rush. Claudio couldn't explain it, but he sensed that perhaps this story had more layers than it seemed. It's curious how signs of greatness often go unnoticed by those who only see superficial brilliance. Andre only saw her worn clothes and faded shoes. He didn't see her posture, which, even when tired, never slouched. He didn't see the way she walked, always determined like someone with a certain destiny, even if it's still far from it. Perhaps because seeing this kind of greatness requires something he hadn't yet learned: humility. And deep down, life was already silently setting the stage for this lesson to be played out. Andre had no idea that every mockery hurled at that woman was merely building momentum for the moment when the world would decide to reverse roles. Because the world always reverses roles, and usually does so in the most unexpected ways possible. She unknowingly became part of Andre's silent routine. Every time she passed, she seemed to serve as a reminder to reinforce his own narrative of superiority. And like any arrogant person who believes themselves untouchable, he began to believe that this kind of judgment was a sign of high standards. What he didn't realize is that the deeper he sank into this vice of belittling, the further he distanced himself from what truly matters, and which, curiously, cannot be bought. Compassion, for example, empathy, or simply respect for others. Simple things, yet rare in the world he lived in, where the shine of silverware blinded the eyes and numbed the heart. On a muggy Thursday afternoon, Andre sat alone in the cafe, absent-mindedly leafing through a business magazine. The pages featured headlines about millionaires, corporate mergers, and record profits. When he looked up, he saw his wife again, crossing the street with firm steps, balancing 2 cardboard boxes on her thin arms. One of the cars honked impatiently, and she, with a quick, confident gesture, quickened her pace. Andre shook his head and commented to himself in a tone thick with sarcasm, "Yes, everyone is born for the stage they deserve." The phrase slipped out like a gentle poison, but the waiter passing by with a tray laden with crystal glasses flinched slightly. Sometimes a phrase reveals more about the speaker than its intended target. Andre didn't understand, but he was beginning to become the target of uncomfortable looks. His comments were no longer seen as refined humor, but as gratuitous cruelty. But for him, it was a sign of courage, as if he had a special gift for speaking truths no one wants to hear. The problem was, they weren't truths at all, but rather judgments based on appearances, painted with the color of arrogance. He loved to say he had a nose for losers, but what he really was afraid of becoming one. Afraid that without the expensive suits, the imported cars, and the office with an ocean view, no one would consider him valuable. This fear was well hidden. He masked it with sharp phrases, restrained laughter, and an air of someone who was always above it all. But inside, Andre lived surrounded by ghosts. The greatest of these was the memory of his impoverished childhood, which he tried to erase from his memory, as if it were a shameful stain. He had grown up in a small house with peeling walls, and nights where dinner consisted of stale bread. When he had money, he swore he would never be seen as that boy again. And in the process of escaping the past, He began to treat anyone who reminded him of it as an enemy. That's why he mocked his wife, because she reminded him, even if he didn't want to admit it, of the boy he tried to bury along with the old holy shoes he once wore. This is a common trap, transforming old traumas into contemporary arrogance. Many people who achieve wealth end up distancing themselves from their roots, believing they need to reject everything that seems simple to prove they've succeeded. Andre fell into this exact trap. The more success he accumulated, the more he despised those who seemed to have no success at all. But success, as life so often proves, is a fragile illusion when built on comparisons. All it takes is a stronger wind, and the castle crumbles. That week, the universe seemed determined to place them both in the same situation. The woman passed the cafe 3 days in a row, always in a hurry, always with that concentrated expression of someone carrying the world on their shoulders and yet still walking. Andre began to notice details that irritated him, perhaps because he felt he couldn't fit her into the mental boxes he usually put people in. She didn't beg, didn't complain, didn't show shame. She simply walked with dignity, and this bothered him more than he cared to admit. How could someone with so little carry such an air of quiet grandeur? One afternoon it was raining heavily, and she appeared with a torn umbrella, balancing a stack of soaked notebooks. She stopped at the cafe door, shook the water off her shoes, and quickly went inside to order a glass of water. Andre, who was at his usual table, chuckled softly and said to the waiter, "It seems that the flood also has a set time for the poor." The waiter pretended not to hear, but his eyes hardened. The woman thanked him for the glass with a tired smile, drank silently, and stepped out into the rain again. Andre watched her walk away, a frail figure braving the downpour, and felt a strange pleasure at the thought that he would never have to go through that again. But what he didn't know is that the world is watching. It's always watching, and from time to time it chooses to reveal who we truly are, usually when we least expect it. That woman he thought insignificant carried within her something Andre could never have imagined. A secret that, when revealed, would turn every one of his laughs into bitter memories. But for now he kept laughing, like someone walking along the edge of a cliff, unaware that the edge is giving way with every step. Over the next few days, something curious began to happen. Claudio, the friend who always accompanied him to the cafe, began to observe Andre with a different perspective, as if he were beginning to see what he had previously ignored. One day, after the woman passed by and Andre made another of his venomous comments, Claudio responded, "Have you noticed that she never looks at the ground?" Andre frowned. So what? So what if someone who's already accustomed to failure walks around with their eyes downcast? Not her. It seems like she sees a place she hasn't reached yet. But will? Andre laughed, but it was weak, almost nervous. That sentence echoed in his mind longer than he cared to admit. Deep down, something in him knew Claudio was right. There truly was something strange about that woman, a kind of strength that didn't match the image he insisted on painting of her. But admitting this would mean questioning his entire worldview, and Andre wasn't ready to do that. So he preferred to double down, continuing his mockery, like someone trying to silence a nagging doubt with forced laughter. It's funny how we do this sometimes. We attack what we don't understand, because the mystery of others exposes the holes within us. And so, day after day, Andre dug his own trap, laughing at someone he didn't yet know would change his life forever. He just didn't imagine that the moment of shock was much closer than he thought. On Saturday morning, Andre arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. He was in good spirits, his suit jacket crisp and his shoes gleaming like mirrors. He carried a leather briefcase filled with contracts and figures, things he loved to display like invisible medals. He sat by the window, ordered his double espresso, and watched the city wake up. And then, as if the universe were determined to provoke his pride, she appeared again. He was carrying a makeshift shopping cart filled with boxes, books, and glass jars. She wore a simple but clean dress, and her messy bun was already beginning to unravel in the morning breeze. Andre narrowed his eyes, almost amused, and said to the waiter, "I bet everything she carries isn't even worth the price of my tie." The waiter pretended to smile, but his gaze was an uncomfortable mirror. It reflected silent contempt, Andre ignored it. He liked to believe he was admired, even when the signs screamed otherwise. He took out his cell phone and took a photo of his own luxury watch, posting it on social media with the caption, "While some are chasing, others have already arrived." It was his way of marking his territory in the world, proving he was ahead, that he had won. Little did he know that, while he was busy trying to appear great, life was preparing the moment when he would feel small for the first time in many years. The curious thing is that, for the first time, she looked in his direction. It wasn't a lingering look nor a challenging one. Just a quick, firm, silent glance, like someone recognizing someone who still has a lot to learn. Andre shivered inside but hid it with a smirk. He wasn't used to being stared at like that. Most people averted their eyes in his presence, making room, trying to please him. But this woman, no. It was as if she wasn't interested in who he was, or what he pretended to be. This irritated him in a strange way, like an itch in his soul he couldn't quite grasp. And it was at that moment that an old memory surfaced. Unexpected as a bolt of lightning, he, as a child, trying to balance 2 shopping bags too heavy for his tiny arms, stumbling on the wet sidewalk while the neighborhood boys laughed. He felt the pain of falling again, his face scraped against the asphalt, and their laughter echoed like invisible blows. That woman, for a moment, was like a mirror of the boy he swore to forget, and perhaps that's why he wanted so much to laugh at her, to ensure he would never again be the target of anyone's laughter. But laughing at someone to escape your own pain is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. It might work for a second, but then everything explodes. Andre didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out in the most humiliating way possible. Because while he laughed at his wife, fate laughed at him. Silent, patient, waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. And when that table turned, nothing would ever be the same again. The empire of arrogance Andre wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, where he now rested so proudly. But he made a point of building a golden throne for himself, even if it was made of metallic painted paper. He woke up every day at 6 in the morning, even if he'd only slept 3 hours, just to post stories of his disciplined morning routine. A gym with an exclusive personal trainer, breakfast served on English china, and a schedule packed with meetings with big names and pompous titles. It was as if every detail of his life were part of a carefully rehearsed show. And he was the absolute protagonist, surrounded by extras paid to applaud his lines. His office, located on the top floor of a glass-enclosed skyscraper, was the perfect setting for his ego. Inside, everything gleamed. The imported marble floor reflected the natural light streaming in through the panoramic windows. There were modern paintings by artists he couldn't even pronounce, but whom he loved to mention in conversation to appear knowledgeable. Even the air conditioning was set to avoid wrinkling his tailored suit. From the outside, however, the city seemed smaller from this height, and perhaps that was why he loved looking down so much. There was something intoxicating about the feeling of mastering the world with his eyes. Andre had built his fortune by investing in the financial market, with risky moves that most would call madness, but which he called eagle vision. And, indeed, there was courage in his decisions, but also a good dose of luck that he never admitted. He preferred to believe that everything was pure merit, the exclusive fruit of his genius. Any mention of luck irritated him deeply. He said that luck was an excuse for those who fail, and so he isolated himself on an invisible pedestal, pushing away anyone who dared to insinuate that he wasn't made of steel and absolute certainties. Over time, even his friendships became transactions. He no longer had friends but allies, people who flattered him in exchange for favors, invitations, or business opportunities. Conversations were always about money, expanding his assets, international investments, and the next Swiss watch he wanted to buy. It was rare for anyone to ask if he was happy, perhaps because everyone knew the answer, even if he insisted on denying it. No, he wasn't, but he would never admit it. For Andre, showing weakness was worse than losing everything. This obsession with appearing invincible made him treat every interaction like a competition. At dinner with colleagues, he needed to have the most impressive story. In meetings, he had to speak last and loudest. Even at traffic lights, if someone stopped in a better car than his, he would accelerate, just to get to the next corner first. Arrogance had become so ingrained in his identity that he no longer knew where the character ended and the man began. He constantly played the role of the unbeatable winner, and the audience applauded, unaware that behind the scenes there were cracks. A glaring example of this was how he treated his employees. He demanded perfection but offered no recognition. He liked to repeat that praise softens, and that those who want to be respected cannot expect to be loved. These phrases sounded firm but hid the fear of creating bonds and then being disappointed. Andre confused respect with fear, and authority with intimidation. I didn't understand that leading through terror is like building castles in the sand. They appear solid, but crumble at the first strong wind. This toxic environment gradually caused people to fear him more than admire him. There was always an awkward silence in the hallways when he passed. Laughter died, footsteps became restrained. It was as if his presence sucked the air from the room. But he interpreted this fear as respect, and it fueled him. Every suspicious look was, for him, an invisible medal pinned to his chest. He didn't understand that true respect is earned, not imposed. At home, the scene wasn't much different. He lived alone in a penthouse overlooking the sea, decorated by a famous architect and filled with expensive objects he barely used. Every room felt like a showcase, but none felt like home. The kitchen gleamed as if it had never been touched. The bed, always impeccably made, rarely received more than 4 hours of sleep a night. Andre used to say that sleep is for the weak, but the truth is that the silence of the early morning made him restless. It was in the darkness that the ghosts returned, memories of a childhood he had buried beneath layers of luxury, but which remained there, throbbing like a poorly healed wound. The curious thing is that, despite all this brilliance, Andre lived with the feeling he had something to prove, though he didn't know exactly what. Like an athlete who's already won the race but keeps running because he can't stop. Every new car, every investment, every compliment on social media was just a temporary dose of relief. Soon the anxiety returned, whispering that everything could disappear overnight, and so he couldn't slow down. He couldn't falter. He especially couldn't appear fragile. This armor of arrogance also shaped the way he saw the world. For Andre, there were two categories of people: those who succeed and those who serve as a ladder. There was no middle ground. If someone was struggling, it was because they didn't want it enough. If someone worked hard and still didn't prosper, it was because they lacked vision. He repeated these slogans like mantras, convinced that life was a ring and that compassion was a dangerous luxury that slowed fighters down. So when he saw someone humble, his automatic reflex was to scoff. It was as if he wanted to crush any reminder that he himself had ever been there. But this narrow vision blinded him to the essential. He didn't realize, for example, that the people he most admired, the great entrepreneurs, the billionaires he collected through books and podcasts, talked constantly about empathy, purpose, and contribution. While they built empires to serve, he built one to protect himself. His empire was made of thick walls and mirrored windows, not to see the world, but to hide from it. This isolation made him seem powerful, but it also made him fragile. After all, those who lock themselves in a gilded tower forget what it's like to walk with their feet on the ground. And when life decides to shake the foundations, those at the top are the ones who fall the hardest. Andre had no idea of this. He believed he was at the pinnacle, in absolute control, immune to storms. He didn't realize that right under his eyes, a simple woman crossing the street with a shopping cart held more power than all his millions combined. And, while he continued to feed his empire of appearances, fate silently sharpened the blade that would cut his arrogance at the root. The invisible woman. While Andre displayed his invisible trophies and stacked his achievements like one stacking gold bricks, that woman lived in a world where every penny had a name, and every gesture of hope was a form of resistance. Her name was Helena, though Andre never bothered to find out. To him, she was just the poor woman with the bag, an irrelevant detail in the landscape of his luxurious daily life. But to herself, Helena was much more than that. She was a daughter, a mother, a worker, a dreamer, a survivor, and above all, someone who had refused to become bitter, even when life seemed to have done everything it could to make her so. He lived in a small, semi-detached house in the back of an old neighborhood, where the peeling walls carried stories the world couldn't see. The door creaked when opened, and the cement floor was cold in winter. But that small space was the only place he could breathe, without feeling like he had to prove anything to anyone. Helena woke every day at 4:30 in the morning, before the sun even dared to rise. She prepared strong, cheap coffee, separated the day-old bread, cut it into slices, and spread a little margarine on it to stave off the children's hunger. She had 2 young children, Pedro, 8, and Ana, 6, who still dreamed too big to realize the world was trying to shrink their dreams. After dropping them off at the local public school, she would walk for nearly 40 minutes to the warehouse where she worked as a contract seamstress. She spent the entire day hunched over her machine, the deafening noise of needles and motors competing with her thoughts. She was paid by the piece, which meant every wasted second cost her a penny she couldn't afford to lose. And yet, instead of complaining, she smiled. A tired smile, true but sincere, like someone who has decided that dignity can't depend on the size of one's bank account. At night, when he returned home with throbbing feet and aching fingers, he still found the strength to help his children with their schoolwork. Pedro wanted to be an engineer. Ana dreamed of being a doctor. Helena listened attentively, even when her eyes wanted to close from exhaustion. He didn't say it would be difficult, though he knew it would be. He simply repeated that they could be whatever they wanted, as long as they never lost their kindness. Because for her, character was worth more than titles, a lesson she had learned the hard way. Few people knew, but Helena had been a brilliant student in her youth. She finished high school with top grades, and even earned a partial scholarship to a business school. But in her second semester, her mother fell ill, and she had to drop out of school to work and pay the bills. Life got tougher, and she had to chase her dreams, abandoning her own to keep her family's dreams alive. Since then, she's carried this silent guilt on her shoulders, the weight of a future she almost had, but which slipped through the cracks of necessity. But instead of rebelling, she chose to rebuild herself in silence. She used every scrap of free time to study alone, reading books borrowed from the community library, watching free classes on her old cell phone that crashed every 2 minutes. While the world slept, Helena learned about finance, entrepreneurship, digital marketing, and management. She took notes in old notebooks, memorized formulas, and drafted business plans that she kept folded inside a shoebox. No one saw, no one knew, and perhaps that's why no one believed what she was capable of. Andre certainly didn't. To him, Helena was just a passing shadow on the sidewalk, an invisible piece on the chessboard of life. I couldn't imagine that behind that undone bun and those worn-out shoes lay a sharp mind, hungry for knowledge, and an indomitable heart that refused to accept defeat as fate. What Andre didn't understand is that some of the greatest empires are born of silence, not the spotlight. Helena knew this. She knew that those who shout a lot are usually trying to convince themselves they're not afraid, and she no longer had time to be afraid. On weekends, she transformed her small kitchen into a laboratory for experiments. She prepared recipes for preserves, jellies, and jams, using fruit donated by neighbors or purchased at a discount at the end of the market. She wrote everything down with almost scientific precision, tested recycled packaging, and calculated the cost of each ingredient. Little by little, she began selling her jars at the entrances of neighborhood buildings and at street markets. She didn't earn much, but each sale was a reminder that she could still build something with her own hands. It was small, but it was hers, and this filled her with a quiet pride that Andre would never understand. Even so, Helena remained invisible to most. People saw only the woman in a hurry with heavy bags, never the determined strategist who learned marketing in the wee hours of the morning. They saw her messy hair, but not the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about her children. They saw her worn shoes, but not the firm steps of someone who has already decided she won't stop. This is the detail arrogant people always forget. True greatness almost never makes a noise at first. It sprouts hidden, like the roots of a tree that will one day break through the asphalt. Sometimes, when she returned home after an exhausting day, Helena would pause for a few seconds in front of the living room mirror and stare at her own reflection. She didn't see a defeated woman, even though the world tried to convince her of that. She saw a warrior on the march, even if slowly. She knew she still had a long way to go, but she also knew she had already come a long way from the depths of the pit where she began. And it was this silent recognition that kept her standing, while so many others collapsed under the weight of appearances. While Andre collected applause from strangers, Helena collected small, invisible victories. A new client, a high grade from her son, a bill paid on time, a week without being late on rent. Things that don't make headlines, but build foundations more solid than any glass building. The world may laugh at these discrete achievements, but it is on them that true personal revolutions are built. And without knowing it, she was already heading toward the greatest revolution of all. Because destiny has a curious way of rewarding those who persist in silence. While Andre laughed at her, Helena continued to accumulate invisible victories, each one like a secret brick in the foundation of something much greater than anyone could have anticipated. And soon, much sooner than Andre could have imagined, that invisible woman would occupy a place where no one could pretend not to see her. The shock of contrast fate loves ironies, and on that Monday morning, it seemed determined to make them the main spectacle. Andre was to be speaking at a business event downtown, one of those conferences that mixes catchphrases, stage lights, and egos too inflated to fit in the auditorium seats. He wore a navy blue suit fresh from the tailor shop, an Italian tie, and shoes that gleamed like polished obsidian. As he straightened his cuffs and practiced his calculated smile in front of the mirror, he mentally repeated the numbers that would impress the audience: double-digit profits, exponential growth, success stories. Andre knew how to enchant crowds, or at least he thought he did. Helena, for her part, had no idea that day would put her in the same space as the man who had laughed at her so often. She was exhausted. She had spent the early morning preparing a new batch of jams to deliver to a community booth at the event itself, where small local entrepreneurs would have the chance to showcase their products. It was a rare and precious opportunity, earned after weeks of filling out forms, submitting proposals, and juggling time and money. She wore a simple, light cotton dress, her hair tied back with a patterned scarf, and a paper badge hung around her neck with string. When she arrived at the convention center carrying 2 heavy boxes, she barely noticed the luxury surrounding her. All she could think about was how to keep her hands steady despite her fatigue. As she set up her small space in the side hallway, Andre arrived through the main entrance, surrounded by flashes of light, greetings, and enthusiastic handshakes. He looked like a movie star on opening night. He walked with a firm stride and an impeccable smile, absorbing the admiration like someone breathing pure oxygen. People instinctively moved aside to make way, as if the air around him had changed density. And it was precisely in this atmosphere of reverence that the improbable happened. Their paths crossed in the middle of the lobby before dozens of attentive gazes. Helena was distracted, balancing a glass jar and a notepad, when she tripped on a wrinkled rug and dropped one of the jars. The glass didn't break, but the sharp thud echoed through the room, instantly drawing glances. Andre, who was passing nearby with a group of businessmen, turned and immediately recognized the figure he had so often ridiculed from the cafe window. A wry smile formed on his lips before he could stop himself, and, loud enough for everyone around him to hear, he blurted out, "Be careful there. This is no place for street fairs." A muffled chuckle swept through the group like a swift wave. Some looked down, embarrassed. Others laughed reflexively, trying to please him. Helena, for a second, froze. Not because of the comment itself, she'd heard worse, but because of the calculated cruelty with which he'd said it, like someone throwing a stone expecting to see the target shatter. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her eyes steady, calmly bent down, picked up the jar, and placed it back in the box. She said nothing. She just kept walking with her spine straight and her head held high, as if that sentence had been nothing more than the wind blowing past. But her silence carried more weight than any answer. One of the organizers, who had been watching the scene, frowned and looked away from Andre, as if his brilliance had suddenly lost its charm. Claudio, his longtime friend, was a few steps behind and this time couldn't contain his disapproving expression. Andre, however, smiled with satisfaction, thinking he had held his ground. That was how he saw the world, a board where he needed to step on the smaller pieces to keep moving forward. He didn't understand that each gesture like that was, in fact, a crack in his own image, and cracks, even invisible ones, always grow. Throughout the morning, Helena stood at her discreet booth in the side hallway, offering samples of her homemade jams to the few visitors who passed by. She spoke gently, explaining the ingredients and the artisanal process with a twinkle in her eye that belied her fatigue. Some tasted politely and moved on. Others bought a jar or two and praised her with genuine enthusiasm. She carefully recorded each sale, tucking the money into a crumpled envelope. For her, each coin represented another small victory, and each genuine smile she received was a reminder that it was worth continuing. Meanwhile, Andre was receiving a standing ovation on the main stage. Colorful lights, loud music, dozens of cell phones pointed at him as if he were the center of the universe. He spoke for 40 minutes about meritocracy, vision, discipline, and courage. He used complex graphs, quoted quotes from famous authors he'd never read, and concluded with a video showing his cars, his properties, and the behind-the-scenes of his high-performance routine. The audience gave him a standing ovation. It was all he needed, applause to keep him believing he was untouchable. However, something curious happened late in the afternoon. One of the event organizers walked down the side aisle and tried one of Helena's jams. Her eyes lit up. She called over another colleague, then another, and within minutes, a small line formed in front of the simple booth. People took photos, asked questions, and asked for business cards. Helena answered everyone patiently and with a shy smile, surprised by the sudden response. Unbeknownst to her, her story had been mentioned over the event's sound system by that same organizer, who was impressed to learn that she was a single mother and did everything herself, from the preparation to the packaging design. As Andre passed through the hallway again, already on his way out, he noticed the small crowd around the booth. He frowned, curious and irritated, and slowed his pace. He recognized the figure with the colorful scarf in her hair, the tired, steady eyes. Only now there was something different in the air. People were looking at her with admiration. There were smiles, compliments, interest. Helena didn't seem out of place. She seemed the center of her own little universe, made of authenticity. And that disconcerted him in a way he couldn't explain. For a moment he stood still, watching from afar, trying to understand why that scene bothered him so much. It wasn't envy exactly. It was something deeper, more disturbing, as if he were witnessing a living contradiction that defied all the rules he believed governed the world. How could someone he considered a failure attract so much attention effortlessly, without ostentation, without spectacle? Andre felt small, a feeling he hated more than anything. So he did what he always did when he felt threatened. He smiled, disdainfully turned his back and walked away, pretending he hadn't seen anything. But he saw it, and it stuck in his mind like a splinter. During the drive back, as his luxury car glided silently along the illuminated avenues, the image of her surrounded by people kept appearing like an insolent ghost. He tried to dispel the thoughts by repeating his favorite catchphrases. Success does not forgive the weak. The market has no mercy. But for the first time, the words rang hollow. It was as if a wind had blown past and erased the gold paint he'd used to disguise the cracks. Across town, Helena packed her remaining jars into the cardboard box with a calm smile. She hadn't sold much, but she'd received invitations to present her products at 2 major trade shows and had exchanged contacts with a businesswoman in the organic food industry. She returned home exhausted, but with a new spark ignited in her heart. She couldn't explain it, but she felt she was just at the beginning of something important, something that sooner or later would force even the blindest to see her. And although neither of them realized it yet, that brief crossing of paths had been the turning point, the exact moment when the two worlds began to truly collide, a shock that would soon dismantle Andre's certainties piece by piece. The roots of prejudice rarely arises out of nowhere. It's like a silent ivy growing in the cracks of poorly healed wounds. And Andre was, inside, an entire garden of wounds camouflaged beneath the marble. Every laugh he threw at Helena, every venomous comment he uttered with an air of superiority, was actually a muffled cry of the boy he once was. But no one saw that boy, not even he. Andre had convinced himself he'd buried him forever, but the past has an uncomfortable ability to escape through our eyes, our gestures and the words we say without thinking. As a child, Andre experienced poverty not as a one-room house, but as a permanent condition. He grew up in a one-room house with broken tiles that dripped in buckets on rainy days. He slept on a thin mattress on the floor, sharing space with two brothers. His mother juggled temporary jobs, and his father had disappeared when he was still a toddler. Life was a silent battlefield, where each day was a struggle to secure dinner. Andre remembered the times he pretended not to like snacks, so as not to be humiliated by asking for a piece of his classmate's sandwich at school. He remembered the humiliation of wearing torn sneakers and hearing sniggers behind his back. Those memories stuck like shards of glass in his chest. When he grew up and started making money, he promised himself he would never be that kid again, that no one would ever laugh at him again, and to fulfill that vow he built an armor of arrogance. He decided that if the world respected only the strong, then he would be the strongest of them all. There was no room for vulnerability, no room for empathy, only victory, appearance, and control. And to maintain that role, he began to look at any humble person as if they were reminders of what he had sworn to destroy within himself. This is the cruel paradox of prejudice. It attacks without what it fears within. Andre mocked the poor because somewhere deep down, he still saw himself as one of them, and the idea of being confused with this ancient painful part of himself was unbearable. So whenever he saw someone simple, he felt an almost automatic impulse to step on them, laugh at them, scorn them, as if he needed to crush that image before anyone would associate it with him. He didn't realize that by doing so, he was only reaffirming his own insecurity, painting it gold so no one would notice the rust. Over the years, success only reinforced these distorted beliefs. The environment he chose to live in, lavish parties, corporate events, elite social circles, functioned like an echo chamber where everyone said the same things. Those who are poor are those who don't try hard. You reap what you sow. Life is fair to those who work hard. These phrases sound beautiful on book covers, but ignore the storms most people face before reaching the starting line. Andre repeated them like mantras, not out of conviction but out of fear that, if he stopped to really think, everything he believed in would crumble like a house of cards. Deep down, he harbored a binary view of the world, winners and losers. It was as if there were an invisible line separating people, and he'd spent his life trying to stay as far away as possible from the wrong side of it. But that line doesn't exist, and constantly trying to prove it exhausted him, even if he'd never admit it. The endless work hours, the piled-up commitments, the constant need to flaunt his achievements, all of this fueled the illusion that he was safe on the other side, as if wealth were some kind of ultimate armor against pain. But pain doesn't respect armor. It finds gaps, and lately Andre had begun to feel these gaps opening, even without realizing it. Small signs, nighttime anxiety, outbursts of anger over trivial matters, the loneliness that haunted him even when surrounded by people. Nothing seemed enough. Each new success was accompanied by a greater unease, as if, instead of relieving, it was feeding a void that grew silently. This void was the echo of the child he had silenced, and who now screamed louder and louder, trying to be heard. Prejudice, in many cases, is just that, a makeshift shield to protect the parts of us that fear. And Andre's fear was enormous. Fear of being in need again, fear of losing people's respect, fear that if he stopped for even a second, everyone would realize he wasn't that strong. Therefore, he needed all the weak to stay in their places. He needed Helena to remain invisible, silent, irrelevant, because if someone like her managed to rise up, the entire mental castle he'd built would crumble. There's a curious detail here. The more a person fears something, the more they attract that very thing. Andre didn't know it, but he was attracting exactly what he feared most. Helena, with her silent strength, represented living proof that he was wrong. and the human mind hates evidence that contradicts its certainties. That's why he needed to mock her. Each laugh was a desperate attempt to keep his narrative afloat. But fragile narratives can't withstand the weight of truth. In rare moments of silence, when the apartment seemed too big and the city fell silent, Andre allowed himself to remember. He remembered his mother coming home exhausted, her hands red from washing clothes for neighbors. He remembered the taste of stale bread with sugar and the cold that wouldn't go away. These memories made him shrink inside, and he chased them away by turning on another light, opening another spreadsheet, buying another expensive thing he didn't need. But the more I tried to escape, the more the past chased after me. It was like running on a treadmill. I seemed to be moving forward, but I was always in the same place. This was the deepest root of his prejudice, the belief that human value lies in having, not being. A belief he learned from a cruel and competitive world, but which now began to prove fragile in the face of a simple woman he couldn't understand. And this incomprehension, though he wouldn't admit it, was already beginning to bother him. Like a thin crack in glass, almost invisible, but which over time can shatter everything. Because deep down, Andre wasn't just mocking Helena anymore. He was mocking the possibility that he might be wrong, and that possibility grew like an uncomfortable whisper in the back of his mind. A whisper he would soon no longer be able to ignore. Her silent rebirths rarely happen with fireworks. Sometimes they begin with a gesture too small for hurried eyes to notice. In Helena's case, the rebirth began one morning, while her children slept and the whole world seemed forgotten about her. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a worn notebook before her, she scribbled plans that no one would see, at least not yet. There was no audience, no applause, no promises of success, only the distant sound of street dogs and the sound of pencils scratching against paper. But for her, that moment was a silent revolution. It all started with a decision, not to let poverty be her final destination. She had spent years surviving on autopilot, putting out fires and sewing pieces for others to profit from. Now she wanted more. Not luxury, not ostentation, she wanted freedom. She wanted to be able to say yes to her children's dreams, without having to mentally calculate how many hours of overtime it would take to pay for them. She wanted to one day take a vacation without it meaning hunger. She wanted her children to be able to look at her and see more than just exhaustion. And that decision, though it seemed small, changed everything. She began reorganizing her days. She started waking up half an hour earlier to study before work. The community library became her second home. Her old cell phone, her portable university. She learned about business management, personal finance, digital marketing, and food production. Each new concept was like a window opening in a dark room. She took meticulous notes on loose sheets of paper that she kept in a blue zippered folder. The folder of the future, as she called it. When her coworkers laughed at the hours she spent buried in books, she just smiled. She didn't need them to understand. She just needed to keep going. At night, after putting Pedro and Anna to bed, he would transform the kitchen into a small laboratory. He tested new recipes for jams, chutneys, and preserves, measuring ingredients with the precision of a watchmaker. He learned to calculate the cost per unit, create simple labels using colored paper and felt-tip pens, and assemble personalized kits with recycled jars that he washed with almost obsessive care. Everything was done with care, but also with strategy. Helena knew she needed to turn her talent into a real business, not just to survive, but to grow. At first, the results were modest. She sold her first jars to neighbors, then to acquaintances from her children's school. Some praised her, others bought just to help and never returned. She didn't let herself be shaken. She used every piece of feedback as fuel, adjusting flavors, packaging, and prices. She created an Instagram account, posting photos taken with her old cell phone propped up on a stack of books. She studied natural lighting, angles, and engaging captions. She began taking orders via direct message and writing everything down with meticulous organization. It wasn't much, but it was consistent. And consistency, she knew, wins where talent alone fails. Meanwhile, she continued working at the factory during the day, enduring the noise of the machines and the smell of burning fabric. But now with a different sparkle in her eyes, she no longer saw herself as just an employee, But as someone in transition, she was building something of her own, and that changed everything. She began to walk with her head held higher, to smile more often, to talk about her plans with a quiet enthusiasm that confused her colleagues. Some laughed at her, saying that no one gets rich selling little jars of candy. Helena simply replied, "Maybe not. But then again, no one grows unless they start small." This new spirit began to rub off on her children. Pedro began helping her label the jars and calculate profits and expenses in her math notebook. Diana drew colorful logos for the labels and said she would one day be a designer for Mom's company. The house, previously marked by heavy silences, became filled with lively conversations, laughter, and loudly spoken dreams. Poverty was still there, but now it shared space with something louder: hope. The turning point became more evident when Helena secured a permanent spot at the neighborhood Sunday market. It was a modest corner, with a folding table and a borrowed tent, but it represented her first concrete step out of anonymity. On her first Sunday, she sold almost everything before noon. People praised the flavor, the presentation, and above all, the story she told. Because Helena wasn't just selling jams, she was selling the narrative of someone who refused to give up. And stories, when they're real, have more persuasive power than any propaganda. He began saving a percentage of each sale to reinvest in the business. He bought an extra stove, new pots, measuring spoons, and personalized aprons. He learned to use spreadsheets, took free entrepreneurship courses, and joined online groups for small producers. Each breakthrough was celebrated silently, with a tired smile and a suppressed tear. He didn't need the spotlight. He just needed to know he was making progress. This quiet growth began to attract attention without her realizing it. A teacher at her children's school tried her jams and recommended them to a friend who owned a coffee shop. Soon, Helena received an invitation to supply the establishment weekly. Then came a larger order from a health food store. The orders multiplied, and she began working late nights to keep up. She was exhausted, but happier than she had been in years. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was building. Meanwhile, Andre continued his routine of ostentation and control, completely oblivious to the silent hurricane brewing right before his eyes. He still saw her occasionally passing by the cafe, but now there was something different about the way she walked. She still wore simple clothes and tied her hair back, but she walked with a new lightness, as if carrying not a burden, but a mission. Andre, too caught up in his own bubble, didn't notice, but others began to notice, and to comment. Helena, for her part, had no time to think about who was watching her. She was too busy writing the next chapter of her own story. She created a name for the brand, registered her CNPJ, National Registry of Legal Entities, opened a business bank account, and began issuing invoices. All of this was self-taught, researching, making mistakes, and trying again. Each obstacle was faced with the calm stubbornness of someone who has survived the worst. Because deep down she knew, nothing the world could throw at her would be harder than what she had already faced. And so, brick by brick, he laid the foundation for his rebirth. A foundation no one saw coming, until suddenly it became impossible to ignore. Because while Andre laughed, Helena blossomed. And very soon, this quiet blossoming would begin to overshadow the artificial shine of his empire. The unexpected reunion time has a curious way of weaving traps that seem like coincidences. Andre had no idea that fate had been tying the threads that would lead him back to Helena for months. For him, that day would be just another social engagement on his packed schedule, a private cocktail party at a newly restored cultural center with local business people, investors, and politicians. For Helena, it would be the first major public appearance for her small brand, an unexpected invitation she received from one of the event's curators after tasting her jams and listening, enchanted to her story of overcoming adversity. Two worlds that seemed parallel were about to collide again, and the impact would be inevitable. That afternoon, Andre arrived as always, with the practiced punctuality of someone trying to appear too busy to wait for anyone. He was impeccably dressed, wearing a light gray suit that reflected the golden light of the late afternoon, a petroleum blue silk tie, and a watch so shiny it seemed to rival the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. He greeted everyone with that practiced smile, half cordial, half triumphant. In his mind, that room was just another stage to reinforce his image as the man who always wins. Helena arrived shortly after, pushing a cart loaded with boxes of products. She wore a raw linen jumpsuit, her hair tied back in a tight bun, and a name tag with the brand name Roots of Affection. Her eyes were tired, but they shone with something new, a calm confidence that didn't depend on anyone's approval. She set up her small booth at the back of the room, decorated with dried flowers, raw cotton cloths, and pots arranged with almost artisanal perfection. When she finished, she took a deep breath and smiled. She was no longer the woman who passed invisibly on the sidewalk. She wasn't there to ask for anything. She was there to offer something valuable, and she knew it. Andre, however, didn't notice her right away. He was surrounded by a group of investors, enthusiastically telling a story about a recent multi-million-dollar deal. He spoke loudly, gesticulating with his hands, and laughing with that self-confidence that often charmed the unwary. But for a brief pause, his eyes wandered around the room and then stopped on her. Frozen, actually. For a second, he wasn't sure if it was the same woman. That erect figure, smiling lightly, seemed to belong to a different universe than the tired woman with heavy bags he used to mock. But it was her. Helena. Andre stared, unable to hide his astonishment. He saw people stopping in front of the booth, sampling the products, smiling, praising them. He saw Helena speaking to each person with firm kindness, like someone who knows exactly the value of what she holds in her hands. She didn't seem out of place, shy, or out of place as before. On the contrary, she seemed completely at home, as if the entire room had been built around her. This made Andre strangely uncomfortable. He felt a tightness in his stomach that he couldn't name. To try to dispel the feeling, he went to the buffet to get a glass of sparkling wine. But even as he smiled mechanically at people, his eyes kept returning to Helena. It was as if his brain couldn't fit that image into any of the categories he used to classify the world. For years he'd told himself that people like her never got anywhere, and now there she was, steady, elegant, respected. A presence that, even without noise, seemed to occupy the entire space. At one point, one of the event organizers announced over the microphone that the businesswoman behind the brand Raíces de Afeto would be giving a brief presentation. Andre, unintentionally, found himself walking toward the small side stage where she would be taking the stage. He stood in the crowd, arms crossed, trying to appear indifferent, but his heart was beating faster than he could understand. Helena climbed the 2 wooden steps and stood before the microphone. Her voice, firm and sweet, filled the room. A few years ago, I'd come home exhausted after 12 hours of work, and I still had to smile at my children as if the world weren't crashing down around us. It was then that I realized that if I wanted to change our lives, I'd have to start from scratch, with my own hands, with what little I had, but most importantly, with the determination not to give up. The silence was immediate. Even the waiters stopped for a moment to listen. Helena recounted without any pretense how she started making jams in the early hours of the morning and selling them door to door, how she used recycled jars and learned marketing by watching videos on her old cell phone, how her children began helping her, and how little by little the business grew. She didn't use fancy words, didn't display graphs, didn't show photos of cars or trips. She spoke of dreams, discipline, and believing in what doesn't yet exist, and this mesmerized the audience. Andre felt a shiver run down his spine. Each sentence seemed to pierce the armor he'd spent years building. It was impossible to ignore the natural authority with which she spoke. It wasn't the kind of authority you buy with diplomas or numbers. It was the authority of someone who has bled, fallen, gotten up, and moved on. When she finished, the hall erupted in heartfelt, long, and warm applause. Andre reflexively joined in the applause and hated himself for it. After the presentation, a line formed in front of her booth. People asked for cards, complimented her, took photos. A local influencer posted a video saying that the most inspiring story of the night was about a woman named Helena. Andre read the caption on his phone, his brow furrowed and a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. He couldn't understand how in just a few hours she had earned what he'd spent years trying to buy: genuine admiration. For a moment, he considered going to her. Maybe to congratulate her. Maybe to prove to himself that he still had control over the situation. But he couldn't move his feet. Something in him was silently crumbling, like an ancient building beginning to give way at its foundations. He realized he suddenly no longer knew who the giant in the room was. When she emerged later, the city seemed different. The lights on the buildings didn't shine as brightly. The compliments from her colleagues sounded hollow, and the luxurious car felt too cramped. Helena had stolen center stage, not because she'd tried, but because she'd simply become impossible to ignore. And Andre, for the first time in years, felt fear. Not afraid of her. Afraid of what she represented. Living proof that everything he believed about success could be wrong, and this fear began to crack his armor. His armor. The surprising revelation Andre spent the following days trying to banish Helena from his mind, like someone trying to erase a song that insists on playing on loop in the back of his head. But it was futile. The image of her on stage, erect, serene, and applauded, reappeared at random moments during meetings in traffic while brushing his teeth. It was as if a part of him, against his will, wanted to understand how this woman he swore was insignificant had earned so much respect with so little fuss. And this question, which he would have previously dismissed with disdain, now felt like a personal challenge. That's why, one Friday afternoon, he decided to do something he'd never admit to anyone: research her. He typed Raíces de Afeto Helena into his phone and was surprised by the results. Articles from local websites appeared about an entrepreneur who started from scratch and conquered the artisanal food market. Short videos showed Helena explaining her production process, receiving awards at regional fairs, speaking at public schools, and teaching other women how to start their own businesses. Andre watched in silence with a strange feeling that mixed amazement and shame. Each new piece of information shattered a piece of the image he had built of her. He discovered that Helena had formalized the company 2 years earlier, that she was already supplying cafes, grocery stores, and organic food stores in 3 different neighborhoods, and that she had recently partnered with a supermarket chain to launch an exclusive line of premium jams. And as if that weren't enough, she had created a social project that trained more than 50 vulnerable women to produce and sell their own products, generating income and autonomy. Andre read and reread this section 3 times. His stomach churned. While he had spent years accumulating wealth to prove he was better than others, she had used her own achievements to lift others up with her. And the world he thought he knew so well, applauded this. Truly. No faux pas, no fake pats on the back, no contracts disguised as friendship. It was genuine admiration. The realization hit him painfully. Helena wasn't just a woman who made it. She was a symbol, a living counterpoint to the narrative Andre was feeding. She represented proof that discipline, compassion, and courage could build something more solid than arrogance and empty ambition. And it left him reeling, as if he'd spent his entire life running in one direction, only to discover the finish line wasn't there. In the following days, the circle tightened. At every event she attended, someone mentioned her name with admiration. An influencer posted a video telling how Helena had inspired her mother to reopen her small cake business. A local newspaper ran the cover story. From heavy bags to award-winning businesswoman, Helena's story. Andre saw the headline at the traffic light, on the luminous display of a newsstand, and had the feeling that the whole world was laughing at the irony. That woman he had treated as invisible now occupied all the shop windows that mattered. The final blow came one Monday morning when he received an email from the business association he belonged to. They were organizing a major annual entrepreneurship event and inviting 2 keynote speakers, him and Helena. Andre reread the message twice, then dropped his phone on the table as if it had been burned. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet. It wasn't just about her growing up. It was about her now being on the same level as him. The week of the event, the tension inside him was almost physical. He spent his days rehearsing his presentation, adding graphics, videos, catchphrases, trying to reinforce every brick of the absolute winner image he'd built. He needed to prove he was still on top, that her brilliance didn't overshadow his. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, Something inside him knew it wasn't a fair contest. Helena wasn't playing the same game, and maybe that's why she was winning. On the day of the event, when he arrived at the main auditorium, Andre felt a chill. The venue was packed. Colorful banners displayed the guest speakers, and there she was, smiling beside him on the digital screen. She wore a simple suit, her hair elegantly tied back, and held a jar of jam like a trophy. The audience seemed eager to hear her. Andre smiled mechanically for the photographers, but inside he was at war. He spoke first. He took the stage, presented his numbers, his properties, his investment strategies. He received a respectful but unenthusiastic applause. When he finished, he noticed the audience's eyes were cold, like those watching a technical documentary. Nothing he said felt alive. Then Helena came up, and the air in the auditorium changed. She began by telling how, years ago, she had been publicly humiliated by a man who had laughed at her while she was carrying boxes in the rain. He didn't say his name, but Andre felt the blood drain from his face. She recounted how it had hurt her but also driven her. How that night, she had promised herself that no one would ever laugh at her again, not out of revenge, but so that her children would never have to see their mother's eyes cast down. She spoke about discipline, resilience, and the importance of measuring success not by what one accumulates, but by what one builds within. She talked about the social project and the women who now support their families thanks to what they learned from her. She showed photos of the workshops, the smiles, and the stories that blossomed from hers. When she finished, there wasn't just applause. There was commotion. People stood, tears in their eyes, shouts of bravo. Journalists rushed to the stage, businessmen asked for cards. Young people took pictures with her as if they were in front of a star. Andre stood there, motionless, his heart pounding and his stomach churning. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say, or what to feel. Everything he believed about the world had been disproved before his very eyes. And deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Because now he no longer saw a poor woman. He saw someone greater than he ever allowed himself to be. The fall of Pride Andre left the auditorium like someone emerging from a shipwreck. Applause still echoed behind him, but it no longer belonged to him. He walked through the lobby in slow motion, ignoring greetings, smiles, and pats on the back. The voices sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. The image of Helena on stage repeated in his mind like an endless flash. Her steady eyes, her confident delivery, the crowd on its feet. He, who had always believed himself immune to comparisons, felt crushed by one. The car waited at the curb, but he didn't get in. She sat on a concrete bench, her jacket open and her tie loosened, as if the air had suddenly become too heavy to breathe. The world seemed smaller, as if all the surrounding buildings had shrunk. Or maybe it had. For the first time in years, there was no rush, no urgent appointments, no meetings to pretend they mattered. Only silence. And within that silence, a growing hole. That's the thing about pride. When it breaks, the sound is dull but devastating. Andre realized he wasn't just ashamed of having mocked Helena. He was in ruins because everything he'd built suddenly seemed worthless. His cars, his properties, his record profits. None of it produced the kind of glow she radiated. A glow that came not from numbers, but from meaning. And that was what tore him apart. The realization that he'd spent his life accumulating achievements that meant nothing. In the following days, the breakdown deepened. Andre was still showing up for appointments, but he wasn't really there. I'd look at the charts in meetings and see empty lines. I'd hear compliments and they'd sound like noise. Even the penthouse apartment felt like a fake set, beautiful, expensive, and sterile. He'd walk through the rooms like someone strolling, through a museum, touching gleaming furniture that held no memories. Nothing there had a story, no soul. And he was beginning to wonder if the same was true for you. At night, sleep eluded him. He lay exhausted and stared at the ceiling, thoughts piercing him like blades. He began to remember things he'd been trying to forget for decades. The musty smell of his childhood home, the feeling of an empty stomach, his mother sewing until dawn with red eyes. And most of all, he remembered the boy he'd been. Scared, poor, rejected, whom he'd sworn to bury. Only now that boy seemed to have scaled the walls of his memory and stared at him silently, as if to say, "You ran away from me, but I'm still you." That memory was unbearable, because Andre realized that deep down he didn't hate the poor. He hated being lumped in with them. He hated remembering that he had once been one of them, and that's why he'd spent his life trying to scream so loudly that no one would dare see that hidden part. But Helena had done something no one else had, exposed the emptiness behind the scream. She didn't scream, she didn't display power, she simply existed with dignity, and that was enough to show how hollow he was. He began to avoid mirrors. In the rare moments he looked at himself, he no longer saw the confident man he'd once been. He saw a stranger, with a tired gaze and a forced smile. The glow he once displayed had become a mask too heavy to bear. Even his colleagues began to notice the change. They commented on his silence, his lack of energy. Some speculated if he was ill. In a sense, he was. Sick with pride, and pride, when it falls, takes everything with it. On a particularly long night, Andre opened a bottle of expensive wine and sat on the living room floor, surrounded by trophies and corporate awards. He picked up one of them, a metal sculpture symbolizing visionary leadership, and twirled it between his fingers. Suddenly, it seemed ridiculous, a cold, soulless hunk of metal. He dropped it to the floor and began to laugh, a dry, joyless laugh. Then he cried. He cried like he hadn't cried since childhood, his face buried in his hands, trying to stifle the sobs that echoed through the empty apartment. It was at that moment that something truly began to give way. Because sometimes the fall of pride doesn't happen with a bang, but with a hiccup. Andre realized that if he continued living like that, he would end up becoming exactly what he had always feared, a forgotten, irrelevant man, surrounded by things and devoid of meaning. In the following days, he canceled appointments, ignored phone calls, and spent hours aimlessly walking around the city. For the first time, he began to observe people, simple people, laughing at sidewalk tables, sharing lunches in squares, chasing buses. There was a life there he no longer understood, a life that didn't need a stage. And the more he looked, the more he realized he might have been missing the mark all along. And behind it all, her name kept hammering in his mind. Helena. Not out of wounded pride, but because she seemed to hold the answer to the question he'd only now dared to ask. What gives meaning to life? Andre didn't know it, but this question would be the first step in his rebirth. But first, he would have to completely cross the desert of shame. His transformation, Andre didn't know exactly when he began to change. It wasn't a sudden flash nor a cinematic epiphany. It was more like a slow, silent melting of the armor he'd spent years polishing. One day, he realized he no longer had the energy to maintain the act. The automatic responses lost their meaning. The catchphrases rang hollow. The rituals of power, meetings, dinners, photos, felt like rehearsals for a play no one wanted to see anymore. It was as if life had hit the pause button, and he could finally hear the sound of his own emptiness. It started with what seemed small: silence. He began to remain silent in meetings, listening more than speaking. At first, his colleagues found it strange. They expected his sharp opinions, his domineering speeches, his ready-made judgments. But Andre simply observed. He noticed tired expressions, anxious looks, forced smiles, things he had previously ignored. He realized that the people he deemed weak were simply exhausted, that those he called mediocre carried responsibilities he could never bear. This simple and obvious realization dismantled him more than any defeat could. At home, she began to dismantle the stage she'd built to impress. She packed her awards into a box, sold cars she barely used, and donated expensive clothes that had remained untouched in her closet. It wasn't about letting go of things. It was about reclaiming space to breathe. She opened the penthouse windows and began walking barefoot through the rooms, as if trying to relearn how to feel the ground. At night, she read books she would never have considered before. Biographies of ordinary people, stories of overcoming obstacles, texts on purpose and spirituality. For the first time in years, I read not to win scripts, but to understand lives. He also began revisiting the places he'd avoided. He returned to the neighborhood where he'd grown up, walking the narrow streets slowly, like someone visiting an ancient battlefield. He found the old house still standing, though more worn. He smelled the musty smell mixed with memories and stood on the sidewalk for long minutes. He didn't cry. He just stood there, silent, accepting the fact that he no longer needed to be ashamed of the boy he'd been. He realized that all the arrogance he'd built up was just to hide the wound of his childhood, and that now perhaps it was time to heal it instead of hiding it. This return to his roots made him feel lighter. Little by little, he began seeking out sincere conversations, not just pleasantries. He called his mother, with whom he rarely spoke, and spent hours listening to her old stories. He discovered that she too harbored resentment for not having been able to give more to her children, and for the first time, he told her he didn't blame her. It was like releasing a burden I'd been carrying without realizing it. He called old schoolmates, apologizing to some for the cruel comments he'd made at the time. Some were surprised, others moved. Andre didn't do this for redemption. He did it because he needed to reconnect with what he'd lost within himself. At work, he surprised his team by asking about their lives. Who had children, who was studying, who was tired. He discovered that one employee worked until dawn to pay for her brother's college tuition, that another was caring for his sick father alone, that an intern took 3 public transports every day and still arrived smiling. These stories left him embarrassed for never having asked before. He realized he had spent years treating people like cogs, and that because of that, his empire seemed cold. He decided he no longer wanted to lead by fear, but by care. He began to change the company's culture. He created more flexible schedules, implemented study support programs, and raised salaries for those who had been stagnant for years. He made a point of looking each employee in the eye when thanking them, something he had never done before. Their astonishment was almost painful. Many didn't know how to react. But little by little, the atmosphere began to change. The tense silence of the hallways gave way to hushed conversations and shy laughter. It was as if the entire place was learning to breathe again. Andre also became involved in social projects, not for marketing purposes, but out of a need to give something back. He visited NGOs, participated in mentoring sessions for young entrepreneurs from the outskirts of the city, and donated seed capital to small initiatives. At first, he felt out of place, like an imposter trying to be good. But he soon realized it wasn't about appearing good, but about being useful. Every genuine smile he received was more valuable than any profit. The transformation, however, wasn't linear. There were setbacks. Moments when the old pride tried to creep back in, whispering that it was a waste of time, that he needed to get back to winning. But Andre already knew this whisper, and now he knew it came from fear. Instead of fighting it, he embraced it. It's okay, fear. But you're not the one driving anymore. And little by little, something extraordinary happened. The nighttime anxiety disappeared. The apartment no longer felt like a gilded prison, but a serene haven. The world stopped being a battlefield and became a vast mosaic of stories. And for the first time in decades, Andre began to enjoy being just human. But there was one last step he still had to face, and he knew it. It wasn't enough to change on the inside. He needed to settle accounts with the woman who, without knowing it, started this metamorphosis. I needed to look into Helena's eyes and ask for forgiveness, and ask for forgiveness. The new chapter. Andre spent days mentally rehearsing that moment. But deep down, he knew no rehearsal would be enough. How could he apologize for something that wasn't just an isolated gesture, but an entire way of seeing someone? How could he explain years of arrogance in a few words? The truth was, there was no script. All that remained was courage. And that was what he carried now, as he walked down the tree-lined sidewalk toward Helena's small shop, Raíces de Afeto's first brick-and-mortar store. Recently opened and already talked about in business magazines and TV shows, the facade was simple and welcoming. Cream-colored walls, large lightwood windows, and colorful flower pots flanking the entrance. The sign, handwritten by Anna, now 9, bore the brand's name in delicate curved letters. Andre stopped before the glass door, took a deep breath, and entered. A soft bell tinkled, announcing his arrival. Inside, the air smelled of fruit, vanilla and something harder to name, perhaps belonging. Helena was behind the counter, organizing jars on a shelf. She wore a simple white shirt, her hair tied in a loose bun, and a calm smile. When he looked up and saw her, he froze for a moment. Not in fear nor in anger, in surprise. The last person he expected to find there was the man who, years ago, had laughed at her as if she were invisible. A brief silence fell, full of unspoken memories. Andre took off his sunglasses, left them on the counter, and said, his voice lower than he intended, "I came to apologize." Helena stared at him for a few seconds, trying to decipher whether he was genuine. Andre, who had spent his life hiding behind impenetrable postures, now seemed fragile, human, real. There was no trace of the haughty man she remembered. Only someone naked of pride but full of regret. Why? She asked without hostility, just curiosity. "Because I was cruel," he replied, his eyes steady. "I laughed at you to hide how afraid I was of being like you. I thought I had to step on others so I wouldn't go back to being the poor boy I was. But you showed me that greatness isn't about shouting louder. It's about keeping going when no one believes." Helena fell silent. For a moment, she thought of all the times she'd choked back tears because of his laughter. All the late nights she'd sworn she'd prove to the world she was worth more than they said. And now before her, that man was just a human being tired of wearing his own mask. "I didn't need you to believe in me," she said finally. "I needed to believe in myself." "And I did." Andre nodded, his eyes welling up. "I know. And that's why I'm here, not to ask you to forgive me, but to say, thank you." Helena smiled, a small but sincere smile. Then she stepped out from behind the counter, walked over to him and held out her hand. Andre took it carefully, as if it were fragile, and stood there for a moment, just feeling the warmth of that gesture. It was a handshake, but it was also a silent pact, that they would no longer be adversaries but witnesses to each other's change. In the following minutes, she showed him around the store. The light wood shelves, the colorful labels Anna had made, the jars organized by flavor, the photos on the wall of the women who participated in the social project. Andre listened to everything with almost reverent attention, absorbing every detail like someone visiting a temple. He realized that this place was much more than a store. It was the beating heart of a silent revolution. Before leaving, he took a card out of his pocket. "If I ever want to expand, I want to invest. But not to make a profit. To learn." Helena laughed. "We'll see, Andre, one thing at a time." He smiled back, and something inside him seemed to click into place, like a piece finally finding its right fit. He walked slowly out of the store, feeling the sun on his skin as if for the first time. There was no triumph, no euphoria, there was peace. And that feeling, he discovered, was worth more than all the millions he'd ever accumulated. In the following months, their paths continued to cross, now not as rivals, but as unlikely allies. Andre began discreetly funding social projects linked to Raíces de Afeto, and Helena invited him to speak to the program's young people. Not about wealth, but about new beginnings. He told his story with brutal honesty, discussing mistakes, pride, and downfalls, and the young people listened in silence, as if listening to someone who has returned from a dark place and survived to tell the tale. Over time, word of his involvement in social causes began to spread. Some cynics dismissed it as marketing, but Andre didn't care. He no longer needed to prove anything. He no longer lived to appear great. He lived to be useful. And that, for him, was freedom. One afternoon during a brand event, Helena took the stage to thank her supporters. Andre was sitting in the front row, discreet, without flashes or speeches. She looked at him and smiled, and in that smile there was something that needed no words. Recognition, respect, and somehow, friendship. Andre smiled back. It was no longer the man who mocked the poor woman, nor was she the invisible woman on the sidewalk, and together, they began a new chapter in their stories, not as rivals but as whole human beings, who learned that true value lies not in appearing greater, but in lifting up those who are still trying to rise. Conclusion. Did you notice how Andre only began to truly live when he stopped trying to appear great and began to want to be whole? How many times have we also mocked, even if only in our thoughts, someone who carries a strength we haven't yet seen? Perhaps at this very moment, There's a Helena passing unnoticed by your side. And who knows? You too may be letting your own greatness hide behind the fear of appearing small. The question is, will you continue to feed your pride? Or will you start building something that truly means something? Will you keep chasing empty applause? Or will you choose to make the kind of difference that no one can buy, but that everyone feels? If this story touched you and awakened something deep inside, don't let that feeling die here. Start your transformation now, and to continue receiving stories like this, which inspire, confront, and heal, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. We still have many powerful journeys to experience together, and the next one could be yours, and could be yours.